Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping straight into quite a high-stakes fiscal and political situation playing out right now in Brasilia. We're talking billions of reais, a pretty stunning defeat for the government in Congress, and then this sudden intervention from the Supreme Federal Court, the STF.
Yeah, it's got all the elements, hasn't it? Money, power, institutional clashes.
Absolutely. So it all started with this major political defeat for the Lula government. It basically left them scrambling to fill a really big immediate hole in the budget.
A massive hole.
And then the lifeline, this our $20 billion solution, it just sort of appeared. Almost overnight, it seems. And it came directly from the judicial branch.
Which is, always interesting when the court gets involved in fiscal policy like this.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is really to dissect these political moves, get into the details of the actual fiscal policy, that's the payroll tax exemption, and figure out how the judiciary, specifically Minister Zanin, got involved, how he was, mobilized to potentially plug this gap that Congress wouldn't. And for you, the listener, this is crucial because it's just a perfect example of how political fights in Brazil turn into major policy shifts almost instantly. And it really shows how the different branches of government jostle for influence over the economy, especially when money's tight.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely more than just, balancing the books. It feels like a constitutional power struggle happening in real time.
How so?
Well, think about it. When the legislature, Congress, essentially says no to funding, it creates this vacuum. The executive branch then feels like it has to look elsewhere. And when we're talking billions, the courts can suddenly become the key player deciding tax policy.
Right, bypassing the usual legislative route. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, the budget hole itself. The Lula government lost a big vote in Congress on a provisional measure, an MP. And this MP was, it was their main plan to bring in more federal revenue.
Yeah, and maybe we should quickly explain the MP mechanism. A provisional measure in Brazil lets the president create temporary laws that take effect immediately. It's a way to bypass the slower legislative process for urgent matters.
So its defeat wasn't just rejecting a tax plan.
Exactly. It was seen as a direct pushback against the president's immediate power to govern on this issue.
Yeah.
A real institutional slap.
And the numbers involved are just staggering. This MP that failed, it was meant to bring in our $10 billion this year. Okay, significant. But then our $35 billion next year. That our $35 billion gap is now this huge problem for hitting their fiscal targets.
Our $35 billion, that kind of loss throws all your cash flow projections out the window. And what's really interesting is how they tried to sell this MP, the framing.
Yes, the messaging.
The government was pushing it hard as taxing the billionaires, going after people who gain much and pay little. That was the slogan, basically.
But the analysis we're looking at, commentary from Brasilia, suggests that wasn't quite the whole story. It claims that despite that rhetoric, the tax would have actually hit a much broader part of the economy.
Yeah, that's the disconnect. The sources suggest it would have impacted the middle class, even what they call simple investments.
Yeah.
Not just the super rich.
So the framing didn't match the technical reality on the ground.
Precisely. And that failure, that miscalculation, might explain why it failed.
Yeah.
When you frame a tax one way, but businesses and maybe middle earners see it hitting them, the opposition gets stronger. Congress saw that, and, the defeat became almost inevitable. So now the administration desperately needs that $35 billion. Like yesterday.
Right. And faced with Congress shoving the door completely, the executive pivoted immediately. They moved the whole fight over to the judiciary. That's where everything changes.
Mm-hmm.
So this alternative revenue source, the our $20 billion, they're trying to get it through the Supreme Court, the STF. It's based on an existing legal action filed way back by the Attorney General's office, the AGU. And the target of this action is a major existing fiscal waiver.
And it's really important which waiver it is. It's the payroll tax exemption. In Portuguese, that's the desoneração da folha de pagamentos. This isn't some minor tax break. It's a big, impactful policy.
Can you explain that a bit more, the desoneração mechanism? Why is getting rid of it worth so much money to the government?
Sure. So traditionally, payroll taxes in Brazil are really high. Think around 32% of wages just for Social Security. Very heavy. The desoneração was brought in to help industries that employ a lot of people. It basically lets them switch. Instead of paying that heavy tax on payroll, they pay a tax on their gross revenue usually at a much lower rate, maybe 1% to 4%.
Okay, so it's a huge cost saving for sectors with lots of workers, like construction, textiles.
Transportation, call centers, yeah, exactly. Big employers.
Got it. So if the court strikes down this exemption,
Then those companies potentially go back to paying the higher payroll tax, and that's where the government suddenly sees our $20 billion in extra revenue popping up.
almost our $20 billion, it's not the full our $35 billion they lost from the MP.
No, but it's close enough to maybe stabilize things for now. But it really does raise this fundamental question, doesn't it, about the judiciary stepping in to effectively make tax policy when Congress digs its heels in.
And the person pushing this forward in the STF is Minister Cristiano Zanin, and our source material repeatedly refers to him as the ex-lawyer of Lula.
Yeah, and the analysis we have suggests that connection is impossible to ignore in Brasilia. It's central to how this whole thing is being interpreted. Zanin essentially unshelved.
Yeah.
The term used was de-ingavatu, this dormant AGU request.
Hold it out of the drawer, basically.
Right. And the timing is just extremely noticeable. According to the analysis, the whole process seemed magical, very exposed. That language clearly implies it wasn't just a coincidence. It suggests a rapid, politically driven move to grab revenue right after the defeat in Congress.
Yeah, the sequence is hard to miss. Government loses our $35 billion vote in Congress. Almost immediately, their former lawyer, now a Supreme Court justice, finds this old $20 billion legal challenge and fast-tracks it. It's even scheduled for judgment in the virtual plenary starting the next day 17. The speed is really the story here.
It is. It shows how the executive branch, when it hits a wall, can be really adept at shifting the pressure points. They use the AGU, the government's lawyers, to launch the legal challenge, and then potentially rely on sympathetic figures within the STF to get a quick result. It effectively goes around the separation of powers on a huge fiscal issue.
Okay, so that brings us to the political reaction after that initial MP defeat in Congress. The government's response was fast and, according to our analysis, pretty tactical. We have quotes from Lula expressing disappointment, saying, "A part of the National Congress voted against the taxation they wanted, but it went way beyond just disappointment."
Oh, absolutely. The research we're looking at suggests the government is considering some very specific and strategically painful budget cuts. And the idea isn't just to save money. It seems designed to put immense public pressure back onto those opposition lawmakers who voted no.
And the areas being targeted for cuts are, well, politically charged, to say the least. The source material mentions potential cuts in health, education, and key social programs. It even specifically names Bolsa Familia, which is, a flagship program for Lula's base.
Right. Very sensitive areas.
But just as telling is what's not apparently being considered for cuts.
Yeah.
The sources highlight no talk of shrinking the number of ministries or cutting travel budgets. They even specifically mention Janja's travel expenses as not on the chopping block, or funding for the Rouanet law, the cultural incentive law.
And if you connect those dots, the political calculation becomes pretty stark. The analysis interprets threatening cuts to health and education, things that affect everyone, while protecting the visible spending of the executive branch, like ministries and travel. Well, looks like a deliberate tactic.
The tactic to do what, exactly?
To basically engineer political desperation, to make the public feel the pain.
How does that work politically? Explain the leverage.
It's straightforward leverage, really. The opposition groups in Congress parties like the PP, União Brasil, the powerful agro lobby, they won the battle over the MP. They blocked the government's plan. So by threatening to cut basic services like health clinics or school funding, the government makes the constituents of those specific opposition lawmakers feel the immediate consequences of that victory.
Ah, so the pain is targeted.
Exactly. The goal, as interpreted by the source, is to make those voters, the ones who rely on Bolsa Familia or need public health services, get desperate. The hope is they'll then pressure their own representatives, the ones who voted no, to back down later, to essentially reverse their political win and approve whatever the government wants next time. It turns the government's own budget shortage into a weapon against the opposition.
Wow. So it's not just about managing the deficit. It's about using the pain of the deficit to punish political opponents and force them to fold later on. It makes Congress take the blame for the shortfall.
That seems to be the interpretation, yes. It shifts the political cost of that $35 billion hole squarely onto the shoulders of the lawmakers who blocked the MP, makes their victory suddenly feel very expensive back home.
Okay, let's widen the lens a bit to the broader political climate fueling all this. Our source material talks about the current dynamics in Congress. They mention real challenges in just counting votes because of what they call external interference.
Yeah, that's a really important point about how power works or doesn't work centrally in Brazil sometimes. The research specifically points to the governor of São Paulo getting directly involved in federal legislative negotiations.
A state governor weighing in on federal votes.
Exactly. When powerful figures outside Brasilia, like state governors, start directly influencing votes in Congress, it makes the president's job of building coalitions much, much harder. It signals that power is quite fragmented.
And meanwhile, the opposition is getting more organized. Leaders like Ciro Nogueira, who heads the PP, and Antonio Arreira, they're forming a more visible bloc. Our source sees this as very clearly looking ahead, preparing the ground for the 2026 elections.
Absolutely. Every major fight like this, especially over billions in funding, becomes a sort of test run for the next presidential election cycle. This opposition bloc is using fiscal battles to define themselves, to rally their base against the current government well in advance of 2026.
And history seems to play a role here, too. The source commentary brings up a past political fight. It mentions a broken agreement over the IOF tax, suggesting there's a pattern here. Major fiscal deals often seem to fall apart, leading to these kinds of crises and interventions.
That historical context is important. It underscores just how difficult it can be to achieve stable, long-term fiscal policy in Brazil. When agreements between the branches collapse, the executive inevitably looks for workarounds. And if Congress won't budge, the judiciary, despite the constitutional questions it raises, often becomes the path of least resistance for getting emergency funds.
And the final political point from our sources is quite potent. It's the belief that Congress is heading for a great crisis with public opinion after this whole revenue fight. Because at the end of the day, people want concrete results in their lives. They don't just want political maneuvering.
That really is the bottom line for the average Brazilian, isn't it?
Yeah.
Most people don't track the details of provisional measures or Supreme Court rulings, but they absolutely notice when there's talk of our $35 billion shortfalls and potential cuts to hospitals or schools. They demand action, stability. Congress needs to show it can deliver tangible results, not just score points against the president.
Okay, so let's try to summarize the key takeaways for you. What does this all really mean? Well, the Brazilian government has a serious revenue problem after Congress blocked its main tax plan, our $35 billion problem. When that legislative door slammed shut, the executive branch very quickly found another route. They found an ally in the STF, the Supreme Court, to pursue potentially our $20 billion by challenging the legality of an existing tax break, the payroll tax exemption.
Yeah, it's a significant chunk of change.
And this whole situation just perfectly illustrates the really complex, often tense relationship between Brazil's three branches of government. It shows how personal histories and political alliances can influence judicial moves, and how quickly the courts can end up being the main decider on massive, multi-billion-dollar fiscal questions.
And it also lays bare that calculated political game.
Yeah.
Threatening cuts to essential services. Not necessarily just to balance the budget, but maybe to force political opponents into line by making their own constituents feel the pinch. It's just a stark reminder, really, that in Brazil, major policy decisions are rarely final until all three branches have had their say, especially when the stakes are this high.
Exactly. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on, drawn directly from the context of our sources. The government says it desperately needs money, but instead of visibly tightening its own belt, say, cutting ministries or travel, the reported strategy involves threatening cuts to fundamental public services like health and education to pressure Congress. So this intense conflict over revenue forces a really big question. When a government hits a fiscal wall like this and the legislature is gridlocked, how much power should the judicial branch really have to step in and fundamentally shape tax and spending policy? Where do you draw the line?